In the quiet town of Ashwood, Missouri, nestled between forgotten roads and sighing trees, there lived a woman named Eleanor Hayes. She was 61 years old, a widow, a mother in the loosest sense of the word, because the child she bore never got a name, never got a crib, never got to come home. Her house, a modest white cottage wrapped in ivy and shaded by ancient oaks, was the kind of place you might drive past and never look at twice. But inside, there was a stillness that wrapped around everything, a silence so deep it felt like grief had moved in and never left. Eleanor had once known love, deep love, fierce love, the kind that makes you believe in forever. She had been married to Richard Hayes, a mechanic with oil-stained hands and a voice that could sing an old country ballad just out of tune enough to make her laugh. But cancer doesn't care about love songs. It came fast, cruel, and final. After he passed, the days stretched long and empty. Friends stopped visiting. The mailbox held only bills and church bulletins. And the nursery, oh, that nursery, remained untouched. Dust settled on a mobile that no longer turned, on the rocking chair that never creaked, on the walls that once waited for baby giggles and midnight lullabies. The baby, her baby. 30 years ago, she went into labor 2 weeks early. It was a warm October morning. St. Margaret's Medical was bustling, but kind. Nurses whispered encouragement. Her husband paced like a soldier waiting for the worst. And then it happened. The birth, the cry, a flash of tiny fingers, a nose that looked just like hers. But then alarms, a fire, smoke, shouts, oxygen masks, panic. She remembered being separated, the baby taken by a nurse in pink scrubs who promised to bring him right back. But he never came. They told her later he didn't make it. No body, they said. The records were lost. All she had left was a hospital file marked deceased male infant. No footprints, no certificate, just a void where a life was supposed to be. Every year, on October 15th, Eleanor lit a single white candle and placed it in the window that faced east, the direction of the sunrise, the direction she imagined he'd one day return from. She called him different names in her mind: Eli, Nathan, Samuel. But one name kept returning like a whisper in the wind: Caleb. She wrote him letters she never sent, folded them neatly, and stored them in a shoebox labeled for the baby. No one ever saw it. No one ever asked. And Eleanor never told. Because how do you tell the world that your heart still beats for someone who never lived long enough to open their eyes? She whispered into the silence every night: if you're out there, if you ever feel lost, your mother's still waiting. And somewhere beyond the reach of reason or logic or God himself, something was listening. Because just months later, on an ordinary Tuesday evening at a community center calligraphy class, Eleanor Hayes would meet a quiet, brown-eyed man named Caleb Whitmore. She didn't know it yet, but the boy she thought had died was about to walk back into her life, not as a child needing a mother, but as a man who would call her something else entirely: wife. It began with ink and silence. Every Tuesday evening, Eleanor Hayes drove her aging sedan to the Ashwood Community Center, a low, brick building with flickering overhead lights and the smell of old books and lemon floor cleaner. It was here, among the stacks of folding chairs and the distant sound of bingo calls, that she found something unexpected: calligraphy. She signed up for the class on a whim. Her hands ached in the mornings, her knees didn't trust stairs, and her heart, well, it hadn't trusted much of anything in years. But calligraphy gave her something to do, something quiet, intentional, beautiful. That's when she met him, Caleb Whitmore. He was 32 years younger, and the only man in the room without gray hair or bifocals. Tall, lean, with a presence that didn't demand attention. It simply invited it. His eyes were the kind that carried too many memories for someone so young. Brown, thoughtful, always watching. At first, Eleanor assumed he was a volunteer, maybe a staff member helping out the instructor. It never crossed her mind that he, too, might be searching for something. That first night, the instructor paired them together for a lettering drill. Eleanor, fumbling with her fountain pen, laughed nervously and said, My curves are wobbly. Caleb glanced at her page. They're warm, he said. Real. Something about the way he said it, soft, without judgment, settled into her like sunlight on skin that hadn't felt warmth in years. From then on, they always sat together. Week by week, the rhythm began to change. Tuesday nights stopped feeling like obligation and started feeling like something she looked forward to. The quiet ritual of uncapping pens. The soft scratch of nib against parchment. The comfortable space between them that slowly narrowed with every shared joke, every gentle smile. One Saturday in early spring, Eleanor ran into Caleb at the farmer's market. She was buying apples. He was buying honey. They ended up having coffee. Nothing fancy, just a small wooden cafe near the town square with chipped mugs and mismatched chairs. They talked for 2 hours. He told her about his job as a physical therapy assistant at a nearby clinic. She told him about the library where she volunteered. He said he liked quiet things. She said she hated loud kitchens. He laughed, not the polite laugh of someone humoring an elder, but the genuine, surprised laugh of a man who just found an echo in a stranger. The next weekend, they had dinner. Then again the week after. Soon, the town began to notice. Whispers trailed behind them like autumn leaves on the sidewalk. A 61-year-old widow and a 29-year-old man. That wasn't a relationship. That was a scandal. But Eleanor, for the first time in years, didn't care. Because when Caleb looked at her, he didn't see age. He didn't see widowhood or sadness or the absence of children. He saw her, and that terrified her. Late at night, Eleanor would sit alone on her porch with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, the moonlight casting long shadows on her weathered face. And she'd ask herself, is this loneliness wearing a mask? Or is this love finally returning home? She tried to pull away, tried to remind herself of the gray in her hair, the lines on her face. But Caleb never looked away. When she joked about her age, he rolled his eyes and said, "Roses are overrated. I like wildflowers better." He brought her sunflowers every Thursday. She left notes in his lunchbox. They danced in the kitchen. They read poetry on the porch. They went on road trips to towns that didn't matter just to eat pie that did. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't fast, but it was real. Caleb told her once, over dinner, that she was the first person who ever made him feel safe. Eleanor didn't know how to respond. She excused herself, cried in the bathroom, and came back with a smile that didn't quite hide the ache behind her ribs. He'd grown up in foster care. No parents, no siblings, just a blue blanket he clung to until it frayed and a file full of question marks. His earliest memory was waking up in a stranger's house, wondering where his mother had gone. Eleanor felt like she was looking into a mirror, a reflection of grief refracted through a different kind of pain. She began to feel things again. Not just joy, but fear. Fear of what people would think. Fear of what she was becoming. But above all, fear of what would happen if she let herself believe she deserved this. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Caleb to grow bored, to see her wrinkles, to call her ma'am instead of darling. But he never did. Instead, one evening, beneath a canopy of golden leaves, Caleb took her hand and said, "I don't have a past. I don't know where I come from. But if I get to choose where I go, I want to go there with you." And Eleanor, trembling, whispered yes. Because in a world full of silence, sometimes a whisper is all it takes to believe again. In Ashwood, people talk. They don't shout or scream or hurl insults across fences. No, they whisper, quietly, behind closed doors, over church potlucks and pharmacy counters. And when Eleanor Hayes began showing up with Caleb Whitmore, a man young enough to be her son, the town's whispering turned into wind that never stopped blowing. But Eleanor didn't listen, because for the first time in over 30 years, someone looked at her like she was the beginning of a story, not the end of one. Their romance was never about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was built in the small things. The ordinary, the overlooked, like how Caleb would pour her tea without asking how she liked it, because he remembered. Or how Eleanor would quietly replace the worn soles of his work shoes without ever saying a word. She called a revival. A second spring, Caleb called a home. Every Sunday, she made pot roast. Every Tuesday, they still went to calligraphy class. And on Thursday nights, they sat on the porch swing listening to the crickets hum while Caleb read her letters he wrote, just for her. Little poems, bits of thoughts, memories that never happened but felt like they could have. They moved in together 6 months after their first kiss. It wasn't scandalous to them, just right. Comfortable. Familiar in a way that neither of them could explain. Their rhythms synced without effort. Like their lives had always been meant to intertwine, but time had simply waited for the right moment. Still, Eleanor battled herself in the dark. 61. She whispered the number like a confession every time she looked in the mirror. Her joints ached. Her skin sagged. Her hair, once thick and golden, had faded to silver strands that Caleb said looked like moonlight. But even as he held her hand and kissed her forehead and laughed at her jokes, part of her couldn't stop the voice in her head from screaming. You're too old, too broken, too late. But Caleb, God, Caleb, he never faltered. You make me feel like I matter, he told her one evening, curled up beside her under the quilt Richard had left behind. Not like I'm being fixed, like I'm being seen. He had never belonged anywhere. Bounced through 12 foster homes by the age of 10. Some kind, some cruel, most indifferent. He spoke about it rarely, and only in pieces. A closet he was locked in for hours. A family who returned him because he didn't connect. A mother figure who used to sing lullabies and then vanished one day with no goodbye. But he remembered the blue blanket. Always the blanket. The only thing that smelled like safety. It wasn't until Eleanor asked about his birth family that he grew quiet. I don't remember them, he said. But sometimes I imagine what she looked like. My mom. Sometimes I think she smelled like cinnamon. That she would have held me real close. Told me I was special. Even just once. Eleanor excused herself that night. She stood in the bathroom, clinging to the sink, shaking. Her chest felt like it was caving in. Not from fear, but from something else. Recognition. But she buried it. Deep. Told herself it was empathy. Shared loss. Nothing more. And when Caleb knelt on one knee under the golden light of the setting sun and asked her to marry him, no ring, just that quiet, trembling voice, she didn't hesitate. She said yes, because it didn't feel wrong. It felt like healing. They married on a September afternoon in the backyard beneath the oak tree that had shaded Eleanor's porch for decades. Just 10 guests, a few friends, a neighbor or two, the calligraphy instructor who brought a bundt cake. Eleanor wore sky blue silk. Caleb wore suspenders and gray slacks. They danced barefoot to an old record playing Unchained melody. And for a moment, just a moment, the world felt like it had been rewritten. She wasn't a grieving mother. He wasn't a forgotten son. They were simply Eleanor and Caleb. Two souls who had found each other in the silence of life's second act. It was beautiful. It was soft. It was honest. And it was doomed. Because 3 weeks later, Eleanor would pick up the phone and hear a voice on the other end that would change everything. It was the lab, the genetic testing company they'd sent a kit to, just out of curiosity. Health screenings, ancestry tracing. A bit of fun. Caleb had joked about being part Viking. Now, the joke had soured. Mrs. Whitmore, the voice said, too calmly, we'd like you and your husband to come in. Together. The tone wasn't panicked, but it was heavy. Eleanor's hand shook as she set the receiver down. Her tea spilled. Caleb looked up from the table mid-sip. Who was it? She couldn't answer. Not yet. Because something in her gut twisted. A whisper. A feeling. Like the ghost of a cry she hadn't heard in 30 years had just come home. The wedding wasn't big, but it didn't need to be. There were no flower girls, no grand entrances, no sweeping orchestras. Just a backyard trimmed in gold leaves, a string of fairy lights Eleanor had pulled from the attic, and a borrowed speaker humming out Otis Redding songs. Eleanor wore sky blue silk, the color of calm seas and second chances. Caleb, her Caleb, stood barefoot in gray slacks and rolled sleeves, his tie crooked, his hands trembling in a way that made her heart ache with tenderness. They didn't have bridesmaids or groomsmen. No one walked anyone down an aisle. They met in the middle of the lawn beneath the great oak tree and took each other's hands like people pulling one another back from a ledge. 10 guests. That was all. June Travers from the library brought deviled eggs. A neighbor from across the street offered folding chairs. The calligraphy instructor, Miss Wren, brought a cake, lopsided but lovingly iced. And despite the whispers swirling through town like October winds, no one said a word during the ceremony. They just watched, because there was something holy in the way Eleanor looked at Caleb, something breathless in the way he said, "I do." They kissed under rustling leaves. And for the first time in 3 decades, Eleanor felt alive in a way that didn't require explanation. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was living. Caleb danced with her on the porch later that evening. They were alone, just the two of them, swaying slowly to a crackling record as twilight melted into moonlight. "I've never had a home," he whispered, resting his forehead against hers. "But I think I found mine now." She kissed his cheek, pressed her face into his chest, and let herself believe that it didn't matter what others said. That love didn't have a schedule, an age limit, or a rule book. That maybe, just maybe, fate had finally stopped taking from her and started giving back. They didn't go on a honeymoon, just stayed right there in Ashwood, cooked meals together, wrote poems on the backs of napkins, replanted the roses in the front garden. Every part of their life felt sacred. Tuesday calligraphy classes still happened. Thursday sunflowers still arrived. On Sundays, Eleanor made her signature pot roast, and they'd eat by candlelight, laughing about nothing, sipping wine from old mismatched mugs. Sometimes Caleb would hold her hands and trace the veins in her fingers like they were rivers on a map leading him home. Sometimes Eleanor would wake in the middle of the night and watch him sleep beside her, chest rising and falling, and feel such a swell of emotion she couldn't decide if it was joy or terror. Because what if this was all a dream? What if it ended? What if it wasn't real? But the love felt real, so impossibly real. One evening, curled on the couch beneath a quilt made from Richard's old shirts, Eleanor suggested a DNA test. It was innocent enough. She'd been reading an article about hereditary health conditions and felt a flicker of worry. "You don't know anything about your background," she said softly. "It might be good to know, just in case. For the future." Caleb chuckled and said, "Sure. Who knows? Maybe I'll find out I'm part Viking or something." They ordered the kit online, spit in the tubes, sealed the caps, dropped them off at the post office on a Wednesday, and then they forgot. Or maybe, just maybe, Eleanor didn't forget. Maybe she buried the memory of that crying newborn, the evacuation, the missing records, the nurse who never came back. Maybe the joy of Caleb, of his hands, his warmth, his voice, had pushed it all so far down it was now just a whisper in a dream. Until the phone rang, and everything shifted. The voice on the other end didn't say much, just that they needed to come in. Together. There was no panic in the caller's tone, but there was something worse. Gravitas. Caleb raised an eyebrow as she set the phone down. "That was fast," he said. "Didn't they say 4 to 6 weeks? They want us to come in." "Us?" She nodded, lips pale. Caleb stared at her. "That's weird." Yes, it was. And the silence that filled their home that night, heavy and suffocating, said everything their hearts were still too afraid to put into words. Because sometimes love writes its own fairy tale, and sometimes it forgets the ending is already carved in stone. The morning sun was gentle as it filtered through the sheer curtains, painting lines of gold across the kitchen floor. But the air in the house felt heavy. Eleanor sat at the table with a cup of tea that had gone cold 2 hours ago. Across from her, Caleb flipped through the newspaper without really reading it. Neither of them had spoken much since the phone call. And when they pulled into the parking lot of the genetic testing company's regional office, Eleanor had the distinct feeling that the ground beneath her was thinning. A technician, young, polite, far too cheerful, greeted them and led them into a small consultation room. No windows. 2 chairs. 1 folder on the table. "I don't like this," Caleb muttered. Eleanor couldn't speak. Her throat was dry. A few minutes later, the door opened and a woman in a white coat entered. "Dr. Mediam Jaw," clipboard in hand, a kind smile on her face. But behind her eyes, something was trembling. "Mr. Whitmore. Mrs. Whitmore. Thank you for coming," she said, sitting down carefully. Eleanor's hands clutched each other under the table. Caleb straightened in his seat. "We didn't expect to hear back so soon. I understand. And I want to start by saying Your health screenings came back with no immediate concerns. A pause. Too long. But Dr. Cho continued, something did come up in the genetic comparison process. And ethically, we believed it was something that should be discussed in person. Caleb chuckled, but it was hollow. You're scaring me. What is it? The doctor tapped her tablet, cleared her throat. Occasionally, we detect close familial links. Cousins. Half-siblings. Sometimes even more direct relations. In your case, she paused, we found a shared genome percentage of 49.8%. The words fell like bricks. Caleb blinked. Shared? Yes, the doctor said quietly. This level of shared DNA typically indicates a parent-child relationship. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her ears were ringing. Her heart was pounding so loudly she could hear it in her skull. Caleb laughed, but it was sharp now, confused, desperate. That's not possible. Dr. Cho looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Whitmore, is there any possibility that you had a child you were separated from? Eleanor's voice cracked. I had a son. He died 30 years ago. There was a fire at St. Margaret's Hospital. They said they couldn't save him. Were you ever given a death certificate? A body? No, she whispered. Just a file. And a nurse who couldn't meet my eyes. Caleb leaned forward slowly. What were you saying? She looked at him then. Really looked. The curve of his jaw. The slope of his nose. The soft dimple on his left cheek. The one that only showed when he was nervous. Oh God. Her heart shattered. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, this can't be. Caleb stood abruptly. Eleanor, what is this? I don't know, she cried, her voice cracking. I don't know what any of this means. But she did. Somewhere in the pit of her soul, a memory stirred. A baby pulled from her arms. Red lights flashing. A nurse disappearing into the smoke. A file marked deceased, but no grave to visit. No bouvier. Dr. Cho folded her hands. I understand how difficult this is. We'll give you some space. And then she left. Eleanor couldn't move. Couldn't blink. Caleb turned toward her slowly. You think I'm your son? The words hung between them like a blade. Neither of them said it, but neither of them denied it. The ride home was silent. Back at the house, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the photo on her dresser, their wedding day. Her in blue, him in gray, smiling, laughing, blissfully, tragically unaware. That night, she drove to the county records office. She asked for any files related to her infant son's death, baby boy Hayes. She gave her old patient ID. They told her most of the records had been archived. She filed a formal request. That afternoon, she got the call. Mrs. Hayes, we found something. A supplemental incident report. An unlabeled male infant had been evacuated during the fire and mistakenly registered into the state foster care system as a John Doe. Later, renamed Caleb Whitmore. The baby hadn't died. He'd been taken, raised, lost, then returned. Eleanor collapsed in the kitchen, gasping. The grief she had buried all these years suddenly rose up, black and merciless. Caleb, meanwhile, had driven 2 hours to an old orphanage he vaguely remembered. The building was crumbling, but the matron, long retired, agreed to meet him. She remembered a quiet boy named Caleb, a boy who wouldn't speak, a boy who clung to a frayed blue blanket and always asked the same question. Where's my mom? He cried in his car afterward. When he came home, Eleanor was sitting in the dark. I went to the orphanage, he said. She didn't answer. I'm him, aren't I? She nodded. You're my son. He dropped to his knees. But I loved you, he whispered. I still do. Eleanor's voice was hollow. I don't know what to do. Neither of them did. They didn't sleep. He moved into the guest room. The house fell into a silence that was thicker than grief, heavier than death. And every time Eleanor looked at him, her Caleb, her husband, her son, she saw both salvation and ruin. Because what do you call a love that shouldn't exist? What do you do when the person who made you feel alive turns out to be the very reason you wish you were dead? The days that followed were a blur of silence, sobs, and something worse, recognition. Eleanor no longer cried like a grieving widow. She cried like a mother lost in a nightmare, the kind where every breath tastes like guilt. Caleb no longer spoke like a man in love. He moved through the house like a shadow, hollow and stunned, as if some essential part of him had been ripped away and replaced with shame. They stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped pretending. He stayed in the guest room, a room that once held the grief of her late husband, now turned into a place of exile for the man who was somehow both her past and her mistake. At night, she paced the hallways, murmuring prayers into the dark. Forgive me. Forgive us. I didn't know. I didn't know. But no answer ever came. One morning, Caleb whispered aloud, just once, a word that tasted like ash in his mouth. Mom. She flinched. He never said it again. They shared a roof. They breathed the same air. But the space between them was a chasm now. Deep, jagged, and filled with something far more terrifying than anger. Regret. And then the world found out. It started with a leak. An anonymous tip, likely from the DNA lab. Within 48 hours, headlines exploded across local and national news. Missouri woman accidentally marries her long-lost son. DNA disaster. Incest or innocence. Husband turns out to be her child. Now they're both trapped. Their photos were everywhere. Reporters swarmed the neighborhood. A drone buzzed outside their kitchen window. One station ran an aerial shot of their backyard, where Caleb had once danced barefoot and Eleanor had planted roses. Now it was war. The mailbox was vandalized. Sinners painted in red. One afternoon, someone left a cardboard box on their porch. Inside were 5 baby dolls, each with its head twisted off. No note, just rage. Their pastor revoked Eleanor's church membership. The library where she volunteered asked her to take a step back. Even June Travers, her oldest friend, blocked her number. Caleb lost his job at the physical therapy clinic. His supervisor said it had nothing to do with the news, but they both knew better. People stared at the grocery store. One woman rammed Eleanor's cart and hissed, "You should be ashamed." And maybe she should have been. But the pain, it was already swallowing her whole. Their home, once quiet and steady, turned into a bunker. Curtains closed. Phones silenced. Mail unopened. A house wrapped in shame. They barely spoke. Because what could they say? That they hadn't known? That the love had been real? That for 2 brief years, they'd felt whole? Even if it was a mistake? One night, Eleanor sat on the bathroom floor for hours, arms wrapped around her knees, staring at the faucet like it held an answer. She hadn't slept in 2 days. Her eyes were glass, her hands cold. When Caleb found her, he dropped to his knees. "You can't leave me," he whispered. She looked up with a voice that sounded like death. Already did. He helped her up, dried her hair, made her tea, but there was no warmth left between them. Only residue. Only wreckage. Days later, she filed for an annulment. She didn't tell him. She just left the notarized paperwork on the kitchen counter. When he found it, he stood frozen, eyes wide, the papers trembling in his hands. "You really think I'd hurt you?" he asked. "I don't know what to think anymore," she said. He clenched his jaw. "So that's it? I'm not your husband. I can't be your son. I'm just what's left." She didn't answer. That night, he knocked on her bedroom door. "Please open the door. I just want to talk." Silence. "Eleanor." "No, Mom. Please." She didn't respond. He stepped away. The sound of a cabinet opening echoed down the hall. Then nothing. The next morning, she visited an attorney. Filed a restraining order. Not because Caleb had harmed her. He hadn't. Not physically, but because she needed control over something. When he saw the paperwork, his hands trembled again. "You think I'm dangerous?" "I think we're lost," she said. "And I don't know how to find a way back." Later that night, they fought. Not physically, but emotionally. Violently. Words became daggers. "You matter too much," she screamed. "Then why am I poison to you now?" "Because you were never supposed to be here." She slapped him. He slammed a fist into the counter. "I won't let you pretend I didn't happen," he roared. She shouted back, "You're not my mistake, but you are my consequence." And then, silence. Both panting, eyes wide, raw. "I need you to move out," she said. He didn't reply. Just turned, walked to the guest room, closed the door. And that was the night the last bridge between them collapsed. The house had gone quiet again, but it wasn't peace. No, it was the kind of silence that comes before a storm. The kind that hums in the walls, creeps in the floorboards, and settles behind the eyes. Caleb didn't leave the house after that night. Not really. He sat in the same chair by the window each day, watching the trees sway and the shadows shift. He barely ate, didn't sleep, didn't speak. And Eleanor, she stopped trying. She told herself she was done crying, that she'd poured every last tear into the soil. But grief is a cruel thing. It doesn't drain cleanly. It festers, coils, waits. Each morning, she sat at the kitchen table with a pen in hand and a blank sheet of paper in front of her, a letter she meant to write. A confession, a goodbye, maybe a prayer. But the words never came. Only silence. One morning, she found Caleb in the hallway, staring at a framed photo of her and Richard, her late husband. They were young in it, smiling, sunlight in their eyes. Was he better than me? Caleb asked without turning. She stood frozen. He was your father, she said softly. I don't mean that, Caleb replied. He turned to face her. I mean, was he better than me? There was no answer to that. None that will make sense. That night, Eleanor locked her bedroom door. Not because she feared him. Caleb had never hurt her. Not once. But because something inside her whispered that he was slipping away. And when people start to fall, sometimes they pull others with them. Caleb knocked. Once. Then again. Then harder. Please open the door, he said, barely holding himself together. I just want to talk. She didn't respond. He stood there for a long time. She could hear his breath through the wood. Eleanor, no. Mom, please. Please talk to me. Still silence. Eventually, she heard his footsteps retreat. The faint creak of a cabinet. A door closing. Then nothing. The next morning, Eleanor brewed coffee. Fed the birds. Sat on the porch swing as if it were any other day. But inside, she had made a decision. She needed distance. She needed it for her mind, for her soul, for her sanity. So she walked down to her attorney's office and finalized the restraining order. Not out of malice, out of desperation. She didn't leave it hidden this time. She placed the signed, notarized papers squarely on the kitchen counter. When Caleb found them that afternoon, he stood perfectly still. The air around him seemed to freeze. You really think I'd hurt you? He muttered. Across the room, Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself. I don't know what to think anymore, she said quietly. That's the problem. He looked up slowly, and something inside him cracked. So that's it, he whispered. I'm not your husband. I can't be your son. I'm just what's left. Tears welled in her eyes. You mattered too much. And maybe that was the truest thing either of them had said. For a moment, it looked like Caleb might break again, the way he had so many times in the past weeks. But this time, something was different. This time, something snapped. He grabbed his coat and stormed out of the house. Eleanor locked every door behind him, then sat in the living room, a kitchen knife hidden under a throw blanket, just in case. She didn't sleep that night. Her mind raced with memories. Caleb's laughter, the way he used to dance in the kitchen, the first time he touched her hand. The first time she whispered, I love you, and didn't realize she was whispering to her own child. She whispered now, too. This has to end. By morning, she felt like a ghost. She moved through the house like a woman preparing for the end of something. Washed dishes, folded blankets, wrote a note, though she never showed it to anyone. Then she heard footsteps. Caleb was back. He walked up the driveway slowly, his hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. In his hand was a small black box. Eleanor rose from the porch swing, wary. What is that? She asked. He opened the box. Inside was her wedding ring. I dug through 3 bags of garbage to find this, he said, his voice low and shaking, because I thought it still meant something. Her voice trembled. You shouldn't have come back. I don't care what the law says. I don't care what your lawyer says. We didn't ask for this, Eleanor. We didn't know. But we do now, she whispered. And that changes everything. He stepped closer. Too close. Caleb, please. Don't. You said I was your miracle, he said, his voice rising. You said I was the light at the end of the tunnel. And I found out I was the tunnel, she snapped. A place you were never supposed to be. That's what happened. The final moment. The fracture. The point of no return. His expression twisted. Confusion. Hurt. Fury. He lunged toward her, grabbing her arm. Don't leave me, he shouted. Eleanor screamed. Twisted. Her foot caught the edge of the porch step. She fell backward. Head struck the brick path. A sickening thud. Caleb froze. Eleanor, blood pooled beneath her head. Her eyes fluttered, then went still. "Mom," he whispered, then louder. "Mom." He dropped to his knees, cradling her in his arms, rocking back and forth. His screams tore through the morning air, so raw and broken that the crows in the trees scattered like shadows. A neighbor heard and called 911. When the police arrived, Caleb was still sitting on the porch steps, his hands soaked in blood. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He just wept. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he sobbed. "I just wanted her to love me. I just wanted to belong." The house was silent now. For the first time in years, there were no voices. No whisper de palillis. No crackling of the radio in the kitchen. No Tuesday night calligraphy sets laid out across the table. No scent of pot roast drifting through the air. Just silence and blood. When the police found Caleb Whitmore, he was sitting on the porch steps, his arms wrapped around his knees, his hands stained crimson, his eyes staring at nothing. The EMTs rushed to Eleanor's side, but they knew. One look at the pool beneath her head told them everything. She was gone. A mother, a wife, a mistake carved by fate. At the police station, Caleb didn't resist. He didn't argue. He just spoke, told them everything. The love, the marriage, the DNA results, the silence, the fight, the fall. "I didn't mean to," he said over and over again. She just wouldn't listen. "I didn't mean to." His voice cracked like dry timber. Not angry, not defiant, just broken. When the story hit the news, it was like pouring gasoline on a wildfire. From marriage to murder. The incest case that shook America. DNA disaster ends in blood. Missouri man kills biological mother turned wife. There was no room for nuance, no space for understanding. The public wanted a monster. And now, they had one. 7 months later, the trial began. The courtroom in Greene County was packed. No cameras allowed, but that didn't stop reporters from sketching furiously, whispering into recorders, and refreshing their Twitter feeds. Caleb entered in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists. He looked thinner, paler. The softness in his eyes, the spark that once danced when he spoke about sunflowers and Sunday mornings, was gone, replaced by something hollow, something tired. The prosecution was brutal. They called it what it was, a tragic but avoidable death. A man so consumed by his own obsession, his own delusion, that he lashed out when confronted with the truth. They pointed to the restraining order Eleanor had filed days before her death. They played the 911 audio 3 times, letting the jury hear Caleb's desperate, trembling voice scream. "I didn't mean to." She just wouldn't listen. They painted a picture of coercion, of control, of emotional manipulation that turned to violence. But the defense, they told a different story. Mara Jensen, a quiet, steel-spined public defender, stood before the jury and delivered a closing statement that left the room in absolute silence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "my client did not grow up in a loving home. He did not grow up with a family. He grew up without a name, without a mother, without a history. He wasn't told who he was until it was too late. What he and Eleanor shared, was it love? Yes, but it was also tragedy. They didn't know, and when they found out, they broke." She paused. He didn't kill her out of hatred. He didn't kill her out of lust. He didn't kill her out of malice. He panicked. He reached for someone he had just found, someone he had lost once, and couldn't bear to lose again. Several jurors wiped their eyes. The prosecution called Caleb dangerous. The defense called him damaged. But everyone agreed, what happened wasn't simple. A nurse from the DNA lab was brought in as a witness. "We don't usually call people directly," she admitted under oath. "But their results, they weren't typical. We felt a moral obligation to speak to them face to face." "Do you believe they knew the truth when they got married?" She didn't hesitate. "No," she said firmly. There was no deception, just tragedy. The most haunting moment came when the defense read passages from Eleanor's journal. "He makes me feel like the world hasn't forgotten me. When he holds me, I forget the years. If he is my son, then God forgive me, because I still love him." The courtroom went still. A psychologist explained the concept of genetic sexual attraction, a rare phenomenon when long-lost biological relatives, separated at birth and reunited later in life without prior knowledge, develop powerful emotional and even romantic bonds. It's not deviance, the expert said softly. It's biology crashing into psychology, a desperate need to belong, colliding with trauma that never healed. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the air was razor thin. Guilty, the foreman said. Involuntary manslaughter in the first degree. Caleb was sentenced to 10 years in state prison, eligible for parole after 6. Some called it merciful. Others said it wasn't enough. Caleb didn't react. He turned to Mara Jensen and whispered, "There's no sentence that can match what I already feel. I got a life sentence the day she died." Caleb Whitmore was transferred to the Missouri Department of Corrections. He didn't fight it. He didn't speak during intake. Didn't protest when they shaved his head or handed him a scratchy uniform with his inmate number stitched on the chest. He simply disappeared. Within those prison walls, he became a ghost. Other inmates called him the incest guy. Some avoided him. Others sneered. But he didn't respond. He kept to himself, ate alone, spoke only when spoken to. And when he did speak, it was soft, careful, as though every word still carried her name. He joined a prison writing group, sat in the chapel every Sunday without saying a word, volunteered in the hospice ward, holding the hands of dying strangers. He never gave interviews, never wrote letters, never asked for visitors. But every year on October 14th, the day Eleanor died, Caleb would sit alone in the prison chapel with nothing but a folded photograph in his hand. A wedding photo, the one where she was laughing in profile. A daffodil tucked behind her ear. And he was looking at her like she was the sunrise. He never burned it. He never could. After 6 years, Caleb was quietly granted parole. There were no cameras waiting outside the gates. No protests. No welcome home. Just a cold wind and a man with a duffel bag full of memories. He changed his name. Moved to a small, fog-draped town in northern Colorado. Got a job cleaning cabins at a lakeside resort. Quiet work, invisible work. The kind that left him alone with nothing but trees and silence. He rented a one-room cabin tucked behind the property. No internet. No television. Just a kettle, some books, and a radio that played old country music on low volume. Each morning, he swept the porch, brewed his coffee, walked a trail that circled the lake like a loop of forgotten time. In the summers, he fed the ducks. In the winters, he watched the world freeze and wondered if maybe, just maybe, it would freeze him too. But some things don't freeze. Some things stay burning, even when the world says they shouldn't, even when you beg them to stop. And one of those things was Eleanor. Every year, on October 14th, Caleb returned to Ashwood for exactly 24 hours. No one saw him arrive. No one saw him leave. He never visited the old house. He never tried to find the neighbors. He went to one place, and one place only, a quiet cemetery at the edge of town. Her gravestone read, Eleanor M. Hayes, beloved mother. May peace find what truth could not. He brought 2 things, a daffodil, her favorite flower, and a small, folded blue blanket, frayed at the edges, soft from time. He never spoke out loud. But if someone had crept close enough to listen, they might have heard the whisper on his lips. I'm still here, still breathing. You were the only person who ever saw me, and the one I wish I'd never met. Sometimes he stayed for 10 minutes, sometimes for hours. But each time, when he left, he walked away a little older, a little more hollow, a little more forgiven. In the spring of his 45th year, Caleb received a letter. It was from a young woman named Natalie Monroe, a journalism student researching judicial ethics. She had stumbled across his case while writing a paper and asked if he'd be willing to speak. He ignored the first 3 letters, but the 4th one said, I'm not here to judge you. I just want to understand what it meant to love someone before you knew who they were, and to keep loving them after you did. He said yes. They met at a small diner near the highway. He brought nothing but himself and the photo. Worn out, edges curling, creased like a letter too often opened. The interview lasted 4 hours. She asked everything. About Eleanor. about the fall, about the trial, about the silence, about the after. And at the very end, she asked, "Do you think it was love or something else?" Caleb looked out the window. "It was love," he said finally. "The kind no one should ever have to carry. The kind that doesn't ask questions until it's too late." Months later, Natalie's article was published. The Man Who Married His Mother, a love story buried in shame. It went viral. Some readers wept. Others raged. Some called it disgusting. But many, surprisingly many, said, "I can't stop thinking about them. This is the saddest story I've ever read." He didn't choose this. And no, he didn't. On the last day of his life, Caleb walked his usual trail around the lake. He wore a sweater the same color as the blanket he used to lay by Eleanor's grave. He sat on a log near mile marker 3, pulled out a notebook, wrote, "I don't ask for peace anymore. I ask for understanding, for her, for me, for whoever reads this someday and doesn't look away." That evening, a heart attack took him in his sleep. A cabin guest found him the next morning. No funeral, no obituary. But Natalie Monroe wrote a tribute. He died the way he lived after her, alone but not unloved. Some stories are too strange for fiction. Some are too tragic for judgment. This was both. Asterisk. Eleanor Hayes never meant to marry her son. Caleb Whitmore never meant to fall in love with his mother. But between the silence of loss and the accident of fate, two people who never should have found each other did. In another life, they might have been mother and son, reunited with hugs and tears and warm pie cooling on the windowsill. But in this life, they were a love story the world could never understand. And maybe they never would.